So, part two of this series of Introduction to Theory is the structure of a theory shell. Let's say we have come to the conclusion, Jack, that we think our opponent has done something unfair, which has hindered your ability to fairly engage in this debate and win the debate. So, you think that your opponent is winning because they were being unfair, not because they were better than you at debate. So, you decide what you want to do now is to read theory.
Okay. So what would the structure of how you construct a theory?
Good question. That's exactly what we're going to talk about. So, it's a four-part structure. Now, remember how we talked about how debate has a lot of jargon, and one of the frustrating parts about becoming competitive in national circuit debate is learning how to use that jargon?
Yeah.
This is another example of where you just sort of have to accept the jargon and just learn it.
Okay.
Okay, so it's presented in an ABCD format. You don't necessarily have to have the A, B, C, D, but traditionally people do. So they literally say A is the interpretation. However, people are also now starting to just say interpretation, blah, 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 violation, blah, 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 standards, blah, 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 blah. But traditionally it's A interpretation, blah, 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 B violation, blah, 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 C standards, blah, 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 blah. Make sense?
Yep.
So, the first part to the theory debate is an interpretation. So what is the interpretation? This is the rule that you are proposing. So let's say on the topic of jury nullification, right?
Yeah.
The affirmative reads an aft that says we should have jury nullification in a specific jury trial. Let's say they point out a jury trial that's ongoing right now in Mississippi.
Okay.
So their aft is that jury nullification would be a good thing because this trial in Mississippi needs to nullify the law. We would consider this aft to be very hyper-specific, right?
Yeah.
So they tell you in cross-examination that all they will defend is the disadvantages to this specific trial in Mississippi. If you have disadvantages to jury nullification in general, it needs to apply to this specific case.
Okay.
And let's say you never heard of this trial prior to them reading the 1AC. So you didn't even know this was a thing prior to them reading the app.
Okay.
So you don't have preparation on it.
Okay.
So if you wanted to read a theory shell saying, look, you probably shouldn't be able to do that, you're going to need an interpretation or a rule that you propose. So that rule would have to basically say that the 1AC must defend the resolution generally, not specifically in a scenario that, or like, that's a very poor way to phrase it, sorry. The way you could phrase it is the 1AC must defend all links into the resolution and all disadvantages to the resolution, not just specific ones based on what they are reading. Or another way you could propose that rule is say the AC just cannot specify which trial the AF would apply to.
Okay.
Or another way you could phrase the rule is if the resolution lacks context, the affirmative may not add context.
Okay.
This theory debate is very popular right now in LD, and it's called specification theory. So people shorthand it to say spec good or spec bad. Are you allowed to spec or are you not? And if you are allowed to spec, what can you spec? Are you allowed to spec the country? Are you allowed to spec the trial?
Okay.
Another example is on the September-October topic in 2015-2016, i.e. the adolescents choosing medical rights topic. You could spec a group of adolescents, you could spec a medical right, and you could spec a country.
Yeah.
So you could spec low-income adolescents for the specific right to have an abortion in Nigeria.
Yeah.
And your AF could only defend that. So your AF would say, for me to win this debate, I need to show that this is a good idea. And for me to lose this debate, my opponent needs to show this is a bad idea.
Okay. So how do you determine if an F is too specific?
Well, there's a lot of different metrics. Some people say that there's no such thing as too specific. Some people say that you're only allowed to specify the type of adolescent, and that's it. Some people say you're only allowed to specify the type of medical right, and that's it. Some people say you're only allowed to specify the country, and that's it. Some people say it's okay for you to specify both the group or the type of adolescent you are and the type of medical right, but you can't specify the country. Some people say you can specify the country and the type of adolescent you are, but you can't specify the medical right, etc. And then some people say you can't specify at all.
Okay. So what would the next part of the theory shell be?
Good question. The next part is the violation. So, violations say that your opponent, so you provide a reason your opponent did not follow the rule you proposed. So, the best way to illustrate the importance of this is by giving you an example. Let's say your opponent stood up and read an AF that did not have a necessary but insufficient burden.
That did not have?
Yeah.
Okay.
And let's say your theory shell says the affirmative cannot have a necessary but insufficient burden.
Okay.
Did the affirmative have one?
No.
So it meets the rule, right? It agrees with that rule. It didn't violate that rule.
Right.
So do you see how theory shells only make sense in the context of when your opponent violates your rule?
Yep.
Because if they don't violate your rule, then they already agree with it. There's nothing you guys disagree about.
So then you're just wasting time.
Yeah, exactly. Then you should be talking about whether or not we should affirm or negate substantively.
Okay. Also, when you're talking about a rule, do you have to just apply that to say like your opponent can't do that, or say that all debaters must or must not do that?
That's a good question. It depends based on who you talk to. Some people think that you have to provide a rule to all debaters that can apply to all debaters. Some people say you can make it specific to the debate you're in. I think it depends on this issue called competing interpretations versus reasonability. And that's an issue that we will talk about a lot later down the line. We're very far away from that right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But for now, I want you to know that you can do both. It depends on the scenario.
Okay. So what would the part after the violation be?
Good question. So that's the standards. So this is the C point now, yeah?
Yeah.
The A point was interp, the B point was violation. Now we're at standards.
Yep.
So, if you remember from part 1 of this lecture, when we talked about the analogy of substantive debate as a model for theory debate, we talked about how the standards in a theory shell are the same as the contentions on a substantive debate.
Yeah.
What do contentions in a substantive debate do?
They give you offense.
Exactly. So then if they're the same if the function of the standards on a theory debate is the same as the contentions on a substantive debate, what do the contentions do on a theory debate? Or sorry, the standards do on a theory debate?
Linked to some sort of framework.
Yeah, well, they give offense to a specific framework, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So this is the bulk of the theory shell. This is where the meat of the shell is. This is where you explain why it is a good idea for us to adopt your rule.
Okay. So what would some different standards be?
There are so many, in no particular order. Ground
Okay.
skew, time skew, strategy skew, predictability, depth, breadth, clash, topic literature, textuality, grammar, common usage, real-world education, policy education, topic education. All of these, ultimately, the commonality between all of them is that they are different metrics you can use to gauge whether debate is being helped or harmed. So they identify features of debate that are relevant. Like time skew identifies that one part of debate that's relevant is time. How long you spent on an argument and how long your opponent spent on it.
Yeah.
If your opponent proposes a rule that says negative debaters can only give a 2-minute to an hour,
Okay.
one of the most intuitive reasons that rule would be awful is because of time skew.
Yeah.
This would now mean that the negative only has a 6-minute 1N and a 2-minute 2NR.
Yeah.
Whereas the affirmative has a 6-minute 1AC, 4-minute 1AR, and 3-minute 2AR.
Yeah.
So the affirmative gets 13 minutes, but the negative only gets 8 now.
Okay. So then would you have to link that to, or say why that's important?
Yeah, you have to explain what that is important to, which voter.
Okay. And then for the voter, so would that be part of your standard? Like the last part?
Yeah, this would be considered the D section, the voter.
Okay.
And again, I want to remind you that you don't need to be dogmatic about the structure. This is just how the majority of the circuit reads it. And this is how you can expect to encounter it.
Yeah. So do you think the judge will probably find it easier to follow if you read it in this structure?
Definitely. I 100% think that.
Okay. So what would the voter constitute?
So the voter constitutes several things. This is the most diverse part of a theory shell. So this first constitutes the framework.
Okay.
So we've mentioned several different frameworks, right? We've mentioned a fairness-based framework, an education-based framework, a fun-based framework, a jurisdiction-based framework, etc.
Yeah.
Now, if you remember from the framework conversations we had on substantive debate, there's a huge disagreement in philosophy over whether we should maximize happiness or if we just should get like a baseline level of enough happiness. Or if we just do not even care about happiness in the first place. If we care more about our duties.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, I think that the predominant assumed framework in debate for theory is we should maximize fairness. So we adopt the rule that is most fair.
Okay.
We adopt the rule that is most educational.
So then, on the standard level, can you link to multiple?
Yeah, definitely. They're not mutually exclusive. It could be the case that you should adopt the rule both because it's more educational and because it's more fair.
Okay.
However, it could also be the case that a good reason to adopt the rule is because it's more fair, but a good reason to disregard the rule is that it's less educational.
So you have to weigh between different voters?
Exactly.
How do you weigh between different voters?
Well, you have to provide us reasons, us being the judges, why it is more important for us to be concerned about fairness than education.
Okay. Is there any other important part of the voter?
Yeah, several. The next thing you have to explain is what is the impact of the theory shell? In other words, how should your opponent be punished for violating your rule? Do they lose the whole debate? Do they lose a specific argument? Something in between? Do they have to do 20 jumping jacks while they give the next speech?
Okay. So in different situations, it would be more strategic to go for different reasons or different punishments. Like,
Yeah, I
either.
mean, predominantly, people are selfish and self-interested, and so they almost always say it's a reason you lose the debate.
Okay, what would be other reasons that people use?
Well, they say, you need to lose the debate because you cheated.
Okay. So what would other punishments be?
You lose a specific argument.
Mm. And those are the two main?
Yeah, those are the two main punishments. Lose a specific argument or lose the whole debate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there a part after that?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's still more. Now you need to explain how does this level of the debate interact with the substantive level of the debate.
Okay.
Does it come before other issues? Does it come after them? Should they be evaluated side by side? What would that even look like?
Okay. Would you generally say that it should come before substance?
Yeah, I mean, mostly people think that it needs to come before because they say that before we can decide who's winning the substantive debate, we need to confirm that the debate was fair. I.e., we can't vote for the better substantive debater if the substantive debate is unfair.
Okay. Do people ever use a certain framework to exclude theory?
Yeah, there have been many articles actually written about how, like, if skepticism is true, then we wouldn't care about fairness.
Okay.
Or, because if skepticism is true, right, moral skepticism is true, that means we don't care about being fair. Because we assume, our assumption with theory shells is that cheating is bad.
Yeah.
But if you win that cheating is okay, then who cares that you violated the shell?
Okay. Do people also ever say, like, things like critiques or performance debates come before theory?
Yeah, all the time. That's a huge topic of conversation that you and I will have.
Okay.
So there's a huge conversation. If the debate round is unfair because of the affirmative, but the debate round is oppressive because of the negative, what do we care more about? Do we care about the oppression that the negative is causing, or do we care about the unfairness that the affirmative is causing?
Mm-hmm. So generally, what do people say?
Well,
in those instances?
Generally people say what they are defending is more important.
Uh-huh. So what if you're running, like, theory and a critique?
That's a good question. A lot of people do that, and a lot of people say they won't tell you which one is most important until the next speech.
Why don't they tell you which one's most important before the next speech?
Well, strategically, it makes sense for them to not show all their cards.
Okay.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree, because if you just tell what is most important, then people would just respond to that and not the other thing, so it kind of moots a lot of the time you spent on either one of those issues.
Exactly. That's exactly it. But then, in response, some people say it's unfair for you to read both and then not say which one's more important.
Mm-hmm. So would they read theory on how much, like if you can read, how many positions you can read if they think it's unfair that you're not disclosing?
Yeah, like people will say, if you read both a critique and a theory shell, you have to explain which one comes first in cross-examination.
Okay, that makes sense. So what part comes after this?
So, after this, we need to give the judge a paradigm for how they should evaluate theory debate.
Okay. So what would that paradigm constitute?
So, this is the competing interps versus reasonability conversation. Now, there's two ways to decide somebody is a cheater. We could say that they were not the most fair they possibly could be, or we could say they were reasonably unfair. The difference between being reasonably unfair or not being the most fair is that in a world of it being most fair, the voter would be like maximizing fairness, or the standard would be maximizing fairness. So let's say the AF was like 98% fair, but it just did one tiny thing that was not fair.
Mm-hmm.
Or it could have done one other thing that would have been more fair.
Yeah.
If the judge's paradigm for evaluating theory debates is that we need to find the fairest thing possible, they would dictate that the affirmative still cheated.
Okay. So as long as the affirmative is just being more fair, no matter how little that difference is, then they should win the theory debate?
Exactly.
Okay.
Winning the theory debate, though, is separate from the impact, right? You still have to explain what happens then if we've concluded that one side wins the theory debate.
Okay. What would reasonability say?
Reasonability would say, instead of being concerned about what is most fair, we're concerned about being reasonably fair. Because there's a recognition that everything could be construed as unfair, or everything could be construed as doing something that is a little bit less fair than something else you could have done.
So how do you determine what is reasonably fair?
That's a fantastic question, Jack. I'm really, really liking your questions today. I think you're asking all the right ones. It indicates to me that you're thinking about this deeply. That is the biggest criticism of reasonability, is it says that reasonability causes judge intervention and is super subjective, because what I think is reasonable is different from what you think is reasonable.
Okay. Does competing interps have any sort of subjectiveness?
Not really, because it just is like more offense wins the debate.
Okay. So what would the competing interps, or what would reasonability say about it being subjective?
Well, people say the solution is to provide an objective bright line for what constitutes reasonability.
Mm-hmm. So what would the bright line look like?
Some people say if I can prove that my AF had 7 minutes of link and impact turns, as well as was predictable, then it's fair.
Okay. So could you ever give like these bright lines in your case before the round starts, or do people ever do that?
You could, but I've not really heard of that.
Yeah.
Solid. So this is a really comprehensive introductory uh, foray into theory. Do you feel better about the structure of reading a theory shell?
Yeah, I feel a lot better at reading than I would be. I feel like if I did try to read theory now, I would definitely do a better job of handling it than before.
Cool. So do you have questions about the structure?
I think I covered or asked all my questions.
Sounds good.